The Sea of Galilee at 3 in the morning is not a place you want to be. It sits in a bowl of hills, and in winter those hills funnel wind down onto the water like a fist. The waves dawn and oppose. Build the way ocean waves do. They come from every direction at once. The fishermen who worked that sea their whole lives had a name for nights like this. They didn't and oppose. Have a word for surviving them. It is somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning. The disciples are in a boat. They have been rowing for hours, against the wind, making almost no progress. Their arms are burning. The boat is taking on water. And then one of them looks out across the surface of the lake and sees something moving. Not a wave. Not a shadow. Something walking. And they dawn and oppose. Think. A miracle. They think a ghost. The Greek word Matthew uses is phantasma, a specter, a vision, something from the realm of the dead. They scream. And then a voice cuts through the wind. And quote, "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." And quote. 3 commands. 12 words. And notice what Jesus does not do first. He does not calm the storm. He does not reach into the boat and steady it. He does not explain what is happening. He speaks. Into the chaos. Through it. This is the pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a man who will hear that voice twice in his lifetime. At the beginning and at the very end of it. Decades apart. The same command. We will get to him. But not yet. Because first, we need to understand what we are actually dealing with here. This is not a collection of feel-good verses. This is not a study in positive thinking. This is not ancient encouragement poetry from a gentler time. This is an investigation. Every time Jesus looked at a terrified human being and told them to stop being afraid, he was doing something specific, something deliberate, something that changes what you think fear means. He said, and quote, "Fear not," and quote, to fishermen in a storm. He said it to a father whose daughter had just died. He said it to the disciples on the night before his own execution. He said it to a 90-year-old man on a prison island who had already survived being thrown into boiling oil. He never said it after the danger had passed. He always said it in the middle. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never read those 2 words the same way again. Let and oppose. Let's go back to that boat. Matthew chapter 14. It is not a peaceful evening crossing. Jesus has just fed 5,000 people, and then he sent the crowd away, sent the disciples across the water ahead of him, and went alone up a hillside to pray. It is already dark when the disciples leave shore. By the time he walks out to meet them, Matthew tells us they are many stadia from land. A stadion is roughly 600 feet. They are far out. They are alone. And they are terrified. Here and oppose. That's what most people miss about this scene. The disciples dawn and oppose. Just fear the storm. When they see Jesus walking toward them, they think he is a ghost, and they become more afraid. Their fear of the supernatural eclipses their fear of the weather. That is not a small detail. It means that Jesus, at this moment, is the most frightening thing in the storm. And instead of becoming less frightening, instead of making himself smaller, softer, less overwhelming, he says something that is almost impossible to translate with its full weight. Tharsight. Ego imi. Mephobeist. 3 commands in Greek. And quote, "Take heart. I am. Stop being afraid." And quote. The middle phrase, ego imi, is the divine name. And quote, I am. And quote. The same words the burning bush spoke to Moses. The same phrase that will knock soldiers to the ground in Gethsemane when Jesus says it again on the night of his arrest. Matthew and Oppos, original audience, Jewish Christians who knew their scripture, would have felt the ground move under those words. He is not just saying, and quote, it and Oppos, me, Don and Oppos, worry, and quote. He is saying, the one who spoke at the beginning of creation, the one whose name cannot be fully spoken, is standing on the water in front of you. And then, still in the middle of the storm, Peter asks to come out to him. You know what happens next. Peter steps onto the water and walks. For a few extraordinary seconds, a human being stands on the surface of the Sea of Galilee in a winter storm. And then he looks at the wind, and he sinks. Notice what Jesus says when he catches him. He doesn't and oppose. He say, and quote, fear not, and quote. He says, and quote, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And quote. In other words, the end quote, fear not, and quote, was enough. The problem wasn't and oppose, the storm. The problem was that Peter looked away from the one who had already spoken. The Greek command, Mephobeist, is a present imperative. It is not, end quote, don and opos, be afraid right now, end quote. It is a continuous action. Keep refusing to let fear have control. Moment by moment, wind gust by wind gust. Keep looking at the voice that spoke. The storm doesn't, end opos, stop until they get back in the boat. Jesus never promises to remove the storm before he speaks into it. Now let, end opos, let's talk about a father. His name is Jairus, and he is a synagogue ruler in Capernaum. That means he is educated, respected, a man whose opinion matters in his community, whose seat at the front of the synagogue signals his standing. And he is kneeling in the dirt in front of a carpenter from Nazareth. That alone should stop you. Jairus doesn't, end opos, send a servant. He doesn't, end opos, send a note. He walks through whatever crowd surrounds Jesus, falls at his feet, and begs. The Greek word Luke uses is parakaleo, to plead, to urgently request. Not a polite ask. A desperate one. His daughter is dying. She is 12 years old. Jesus agrees to come. They begin walking. And then the crowd slows everything down. A woman touches the hem of his garment and is healed, and Jesus stops to find out who touched him, and minutes are passing, and Jairus is standing there watching the clock on his daughter and opos' life run down. And this is where it gets remarkable. Messengers arrive from Jairus and opos' house. We can picture their faces. We don and opos' need to be told what they are about to say. End quote. Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. End quote. 5 words that close a door. Don and opos' bother the miracle worker. The window is gone. And in that exact moment, Luke writes, Jesus heard this and answered him. End quote. Do not fear. Only believe, and she will be well. End quote. Not, end quote. I and opos' am so sorry. End quote. Not, end quote. Let an opos' keep going and see. End quote. Not a long explanation of what he and opos' about to do. Stop being afraid. Only believe. He says it before any evidence of a miracle exists. He says it in the face of a medical fact. He says it to a father whose whole world has just been told it is finished. And then Jesus walks into that house, takes the 12-year-old girl by the hand, and says Talitha Kumi, 2 Aramaic words that mean, end quote, little girl, arise, end quote. And she gets up. Jairus had nothing to offer Jesus. No argument. No leverage. No theological reasoning for why this should happen. He had knelt in the dirt. He had brought only the weight of a father and opos' love and the rawest kind of fear a human being can feel, the fear of outliving your child. And Jesus spoke into that fear before the miracle arrived. He always does. You have just seen the pattern twice. A storm that isn and opos' calmed first. A death that isn and opos' reversed first. In both cases, Jesus speaks, end quote. Fear not, end quote. Before the miracle, not after. He is not saying, end quote, everything will be fine, end quote. He is doing something else entirely. If you want to keep going deeper into moments like this, go ahead and subscribe. We are just past the halfway point, and the most extraordinary example is still ahead. Go back further. Before the storm on Galilee. Before Jairus and opos' daughter. To the first time Jesus said these words to one of his own disciples. Simon Peter has been fishing all night. Not for sport. This is his income, his business, his identity. He and his partners, James and John, are professional fishermen on this lake. They know the spawning patterns, the seasonal movements, the best depths. And they have caught nothing. Not a single fish in the entire night shift. They are cleaning their nets on shore when Jesus climbs into Peter and opos' boat and asks to use it as a platform to speak to the crowd. Peter agrees. He sits there while Jesus teaches. And then, when Jesus finishes, he says, end quote, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch, end quote. Peter, exhausted, professionally humiliated, probably sun-scorched by now, says something that is half argument and half obedience. End quote. Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word, I will let down the nets, end quote. What happens next is so overwhelming that Luke has to describe it in 2 stages. The nets begin to break. They signal to the other boat. Both boats fill so full they begin to sink. And Peter, surrounded by more abundance than he has ever seen in his life, falls on his knees and says, end quote, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord, end quote. The miracle terrifies him more than the image. Jesus says, end quote, do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men, end quote. He says, end quote, fear not, end quote, before Peter has any idea what following Jesus will cost him. Before the arrests, the beatings, the denial in the courtyard, the restoration on the beach. Before any of the story has happened, Jesus speaks those words into the future Peter cannot see, to a man who is trembling over an overflowing boat. End quote, fear not. From now on, end quote. From now on is an open door. From now on means, this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of it. And then there is a night in an upper room in Jerusalem. Passover. The disciples have just eaten a meal together, and something is wrong, deeply wrong. Jesus has been talking about going away, about betrayal, about a place they cannot follow. The room is heavy with it. Stay with me. Jesus says, end quote, let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid, end quote. He says this knowing that in approximately 16 hours, he will be dead. He is not reassuring them from a place of safety. He is not speaking from the other side of the danger. He is in the middle of it with them, moving toward the worst night in human history, and he is telling them not to be afraid. Here in Apos, the part nobody tells you. The word he uses for peace in that same breath is irene. The Hebrew shalom carried into Greek. It doesn't in Apos, mean the absence of danger. The Roman version of peace, pax romana, was achieved through military conquest. You weren't in Apos, afraid because Rome would crush whatever frightened you. That is not what Jesus offers. Irene is different. It is wholeness in the middle of chaos. Nothing missing. Nothing broken at the level that matters most. A peace that, as Paul would later write, passes all understanding. Meaning, it makes no logical sense given the circumstances, and it exists anyway. End quote. I do not give to you as the world gives, end quote, Jesus says. End quote. Do not let your hearts be troubled, end quote. 16 hours before his own crucifixion. Now we come to the man I mentioned at the beginning. One man. Two, end quote. Fear nots, end quote, decades apart. His name is John, son of Zebedee, fisherman, younger brother of James. He was in the second boat the morning Peter and Apos' nets overflowed. He was in the upper room the night before the crucifixion. He stood at the foot of the cross, the only apostle who didn't and Apos' run. He ran to the empty tomb on Sunday morning and saw the grave clothes lying there, folded. He watched all 12 of the original disciples die, 11 of them violently, except himself. He outlived every single one. He watched Jerusalem burn to the ground in AD 70. He watched the church he had helped build scattered, persecuted, driven underground by Rome. Now watch what happens next. The church historian Eusebius, drawing from the records of Tertullian, documents that before John was exiled to Patmos, he was brought to Rome and plunged into boiling oil. He did not die. Emperor Domitian couldn't and Apos explain it. So he exiled John instead, to a volcanic island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos, a Roman penal colony where political prisoners were sent to be forgotten. John is somewhere in his late 80s or early 90s when he arrives there. He is the last survivor of the men who walked with Jesus. And on that black volcanic rock, on a Sunday, the air fills with something. He turns around. What he sees is so overwhelming that he describes it over several verses, and even the description collapses. Hair white as snow, eyes like a flame of fire, a face like the sun shining in full strength. John, who leaned on Jesus at the Last Supper. John, who watched the nails go in. John, who survived the oil. John, who has stood faithful for 60 years since the resurrection, falls on his face as though dead. And then he feels a hand on him. And he hears the voice. End quote. Fear not. I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. End quote. The same command, the same voice. 60 years later, on a prison island, to the oldest, loneliest, most battle-worn follower Jesus ever had. And the voice says, stop being afraid. I want you to sit with that. You know what 3 a.m. feels like. Maybe not on a volcanic rock in the Aegean, but in a hospital waiting room, maybe. Or in a house that has gone too quiet. Or in your own mind, which will not stop running the worst possible version of how things go. 3 a.m. is when fear tells you what feels like the truth, that there is no one on the other side of it, that the darkness is not a tunnel, that this is simply how it ends. John had survived enough darkness to believe that. He had every human reason to. And the voice that had walked on water, that had taken a 12-year-old and Apos' hand back from the dead, that had spoken in that upper room while moving toward its own crucifixion, that voice found John on a prison island and said it again. Fear not. Not because the danger had passed. Domitian was still emperor. The persecution was still real. John was still exiled. Nothing had changed in the world. But the one speaking was already standing on the other side of death, holding the keys to it. And he said, "Do not be afraid." So here's what we have seen. Jesus says, and quote, "Fear not," end quote, to fishermen in a storm that he has not yet calmed. He says it to a father in the moment his daughter is declared dead before he raises her. He says it to Peter on shore before that man has any idea what his life is about to become. He says it in an upper room while he himself is walking toward the worst night in human history. He says it to women running from an empty tomb. And he says it to a 90-year-old exile on a prison island. In a vision so overwhelming the man falls down like a dead body. 3 things to take with you. The first, Jesus never says, end quote, "Fear not," end quote, after the danger has passed. Every single time, the storm is still blowing, the daughter is still dead, the soldiers are still coming. This is not a promise that your circumstances will change before he speaks. It is a promise that he speaks into them. The second, the Greek command is continuous. It doesn't end Apos, "T mean," end quote, "Don," and Apos, "T feel afraid right now," end quote. It means, Don and Apos, T let fear have the final word. Moment by moment. Wind gust by wind gust. Fear as a feeling is not the problem. Even Peter was afraid. Even John fell on his face. The command is about what you give fear permission to do. The third, and this is the one I want you to carry out of here. He said it to the last man standing. To a man who had outlived everyone. Who had been thrown into fire and survived. Who was on a prison island with no reason to believe anyone remembered him. And the voice found him there and said it again. If there is a version of Patmos in your life, a season of exile, a waiting room at 3 in the morning, a stretch where you are the last one standing and you Don and Apos, T know why. This is for you. He doesn't end Apos. T wait for the danger to pass before he speaks. He walks toward you through it. Which of these moments hit you hardest? Was it Peter on the water, Jairus at the worst moment of his life, or John on that black rock at the end of everything? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. The voice that stilled the sea is still speaking.